Thanks for the introduction, Rob. I'm quite lucky because a lot of my introduction was actually given today, so that's quite nice. I hope I don't have to convince you that psychedelics are quite unique substances. They have sensory effects, visual, auditory, tactile hallucinations, if we want to call them like that. In some cases, synesthesia. They also have cognitive effects. They affect the change emotional state of people. They lead to time distortion. In some cases, the sense of self gets disintegrated. And in some cases, people describe mystical experiences like feeling one with the universe. As we've seen before also, multiple people mentioned that our field developed, or the general field of altered states of consciousness developed methods to quantify these subjective experiences, such as the 11-dimension altered states of consciousness questionnaire. And you've seen actually this plot before. You can use that, for example, to assess and compare different, giving that, for example, psilocybin to different people and increase the dosage, and you can see that there's increases in, it works. For example, elementary imagery, complex imagery, and then you have some things that are a bit more obscure, like spiritual experience, but also things like anxiety. And I was always interested in translation. How do we actually go from these substances to the therapy and to the clinical aspect? And it was quite interesting to see for a long period of time these kind of effects were kind of dissociated from the therapeutic use of psychedelics. But data, like what I'm going to show you now, changed that a little bit. 2018, a study came out that took one of the first studies where psilocybin was given to depressive patients, and then reanalyzed the data and looked at after 5 weeks, and separated the participants to responders that had significant decrease in their depression symptoms and non-responders. The interesting thing about the study was that these patients were also given these questionnaires, and we saw results like these, where the responders in these studies scored higher on some parts of the altered states of consciousness questionnaire, for example, spiritual experience and insightfulness, and lower at things like anxiety. To me, that was quite interesting because it's a situation where the subjective experience of what people go through actually through these therapeutic sessions has effect on the therapeutic outcome. So for me, as someone that comes from behavior and neuroscience, I'm of course interested in what is happening here, what is causing this, what is happening in the brain. And it of course brings this fundamental question that we heard before, yes. Does that actually happen in a mouse, right? I cannot give a mouse a questionnaire and tell it, please tell me if you feel one with the universe, right? So there's different approaches, as we've heard today, to actually doing this, but fundamentally, I think we need to answer the question if mice have psychedelic trips, and we've seen 2 approaches to it, and one about hallucinations before. And of course, once you establish that, we also want to know if they actually matter, to be able to do this translation. So when we were thinking about how we can target or go for this question and set up a project like this, we encountered some things that we needed to clarify first. Because in a therapeutic session with psychedelics, we work under the concept or framework of set and setting. Set being the mindset, the preparation of the patient that is happening over multiple weeks and sessions before they get the psychedelic. And setting is the acute setting where the actual psychedelic session is done. Here's an example from the study in Mannheim, for example, where it is in a hospital, but it doesn't look like a hospital room. It's actually a comfortable place where people feel comfortable in and safe and nice and cozy. And we actually know also from data that better preparation, better set and setting leads to also better outcomes. However, when we look in animals, things look rather like this. Yeah? Usually, you take an animal, you inject it with a substance of choice, you put it into an open field or an empty arena, and you quantify a specific metric. But in a way that doesn't really, it kind of ignores completely what we know from the patient. Yeah? We're interested in just knowing, okay, is that something, how does it look like in literature? Yeah, if I go and I look, how much are we actually taking into account the mental state of the animal before we inject it? So with the help of Anna, who's sitting here in the audience, we went through the literature that used psychedelic substances in rodents, mainly on mice, because the majority of the data is coming from mice. And we looked at some of these aspects. For example, the fact that mice are nocturnal animals. Yeah? You can see here very clearly their main activity is happening during the night. During the day, they barely do much in comparison. They sleep a little bit, they do a little bit here, they eat a little bit, but they're mainly non-active, while they become instantly active the moment you turn off the light. So you would think that, technically, if I want to study psychedelics in mice, I would actually do that during the active phase. However, in the psychedelic field, the vast majority of studies are actually done during the day phase, so the inactive phase of the animals, with a few exceptions here and there. Another point that is also important, specifically in mice, a little bit less in rats, is that mice dislike open arenas because they are prey animals and they have reflexes to a looming stimulus above them. They usually respond to it by freezing or running away. So they like to hide in places. And putting them in an open box or an open field test is therefore also sometimes termed an anxiety assay, right? But the vast majority of the studies, again, in the psychedelic field, use empty, non-enriched boxes without the opportunity for the animals to hide behind. Next one is, for example, the fact that mice don't really like us. Again, they're prey. First interaction with a mouse, if you ever get your first litter and you look at them, they will not interact with you, right? But if you do continuous handling over multiple sessions and days and weeks, they start to like you a little bit more, their stress response goes down. Again here, the vast majority of studies of psychedelics done in the field are done with as little handling as possible. And to me, actually, I think one of the most important points is that mice don't like restraint or injections. Here's an example of a study where the animals were just injected, so held and injected with 3 standard ways of injections: subcutaneous, intraperitoneal, or intramuscular. And as you can see here, compared to baseline, their heart rate doubles or goes up by 2.5, and it stays quite consistent. This is also seen in cortisol levels and body temperature. Yeah? And as you might have heard today, what we do in our field is actually always injection. Yeah? And it has a good reason, because that gives you best pharmacological control, right? But we're actually setting ourselves up always for a stressed animal when we use injection. To put everything together, standard-wise in our field, we do our experiments during the inactive phase of the animal. We do it in empty setups that lack enrichment. We don't do much handling, and we use application types that are inherently stressful for the animal. In a way, one could argue that the majority of the data we have with rodents, with psychedelics, are under conditions that we would consider absolutely not good in humans, yeah? Conditions of stress and anxiety. But again, as I said, a lot of these choices have their reasons and practical reasons, and it also goes into a general problem, I would say, when it comes to translation, specifically when it comes to psychiatry. Let's take, for example, an anxiety disorder. Yeah? You have patients coming, different types of patients with different symptoms. You do your questionnaires with them, and when they accumulate or have a fixed number of these symptoms, different ones, you declare them that they have generalized anxiety, for example. These patients also come from different environments and also are genetically variable. This is quite a lot of complexity in diagnosis that are a little bit broad, let's say. And our approach to study that for quite some time has been looking like this, where we go and look for anxiety-like behaviors, for example, the open field test. We go for environments that are deprived and constant, where we also average the outputs we average the outcomes. And our animals, in nearly every field, are basically mutants, yeah? Unless you work with outbred rats, which is a good thing to do. And yeah, as I said, these have practical reasons and sometimes just technical limitations because they were harder to do. But I think with the last few years of development in ways like tracking and so on, we can try to move towards something that a bit more represents the complexity, what we actually want to study, by looking for not a specific type of symptom, but actually multiple symptoms in the animals, looking at complex behavior and taking into account individual differences between the animals, and also embrace genetic variability that is actually what is happening in humans. So if we take the assays that we can do, or our behavioral analysis that we can do, and put it on three axes. One is the environmental complexity, which goes from standard to natural. The second is behavioral readouts, from simple to complex, and the tracking duration from short to prolonged. And we would see that ethology, the description of behavior in the wild, fits around here. It's natural, yes. It allows us to, if you really want, to prolong continuous analysis, and it's complex. However, it's in an environment that doesn't allow us to change anything, right? So we have to go to the lab, right? Our current assays of doing some of these things, for example, the 3-chamber assay here, or the resident intruder assays, would be considered standard assays. They're in non-enriched environments. Sometimes we're lucky and they actually go for more complex analysis, but they're often also rather short. Some approaches that are people using, like the home cage monitoring, is already going in the right direction. However, the developments of the last few years allow us to actually go a step further, to go for more enriched environments, to do more and longer recordings, and try to analyze much more complex behaviors and embrace the complexity of the diseases we're studying and of the substances we're using. So again, we went through the same literature that we analyzed before and tried to see where we are in the psychedelic field on these three axes. And what you can see here is that the vast majority of studies, at least in the last 5-6 years, cluster around this corner here, with short recordings, rather standard setups, and quite simple behaviors, so individual things that we're measuring. There's some trend towards a bit more complexity and longer recordings, but I think given that we're dealing with this complexity of the substances we're using, with the uniqueness and the psychiatric conditions, I think we should be aiming for a more complex situation or more complex analysis. So to put it together, I hope I was able to convince you that we should actually embrace set and setting for our animal studies in psychedelics, because currently we're a bit lacking in that front, and that we should strive toward a more complex analysis of behavior in the future. Of course, I can stand here and tell you what we should be doing. So we try to do our part in this thing. So we built a setup. That's usually step one. Yeah. Our setup is a bit larger than a standard mouse cage. Looks like this, and is enriched with objects the animal can interact with, places it can hide under, and where the animal has access to water and food. Additionally, we do this under infrared light, so during the dark phase of the phase for the animal. And the setup allows us to record simultaneous video and audio recordings, as well in the future also neuronal recordings, and that also for prolonged periods of time. The data that you get out of it looks something like this. This, for example, tracking of a mouse in the setup, just moving around, and we can do this for a prolonged period of time, and the methods nowadays allow us to do very precise tracking like this. Additionally, I can do, as I said, synchronized ultrasonic vocalization recordings, which is something that somehow has been completely lacking in the field. I think there's one study that looked at one specific interaction. So we're excited to also have a look at this. Beyond the setup, we also establish an experimental protocol that uses enriched housing of the animals, has extensive handling and habituation over actually multiple weeks until the animal actually likes us and comes to our hand when we put it into the cage, we do everything, as I said before, in flipped day night cycle, and to avoid injections or restrain, we do something called voluntary oral application. In case you're not familiar with this, it looks a bit like this. Basically make little balls of Nutella that are laced with psilocybin. And I train the animal by putting the little ball here behind the door, that it has 10 minutes to eat the psilocybin ball, and then the door closes. And if you do that a few times, you'll be surprised how fast they will actually go there, eat it, and then go away. To allow it at least a little bit of the pharmacological control that you have from injections. Of course, it's all conceptually nice. Does it actually work? And we did a little pilot study analyzing the head twitch response. First question was even, are they going to have a head twitch response? But yeah, this is an example of the animal doing a head twitch response. Something happened with the video. Anyway, but you've seen it in the rats. The rats do more of a wet back shake. The mice actually shake their head a little bit. Yeah. It's quite short and fast. So Anna did this heroic work of going through the videos manually and labeling all of these head twitches. We gave the animals 2 milligram per kilogram orally, which is around 1 milligram per kilogram IP injected. And as you can see here, we can see that after 10, 15, 20 minutes, you can clearly see head twitches in these animals with a similar trajectory to something that was recently published where the animals were giving 1 milligram per kilogram psilocybin via oral gavage. So the only other study where oral application was done. Okay, nice. So our idea works, at least when it comes to the voluntary oral application. What can we do with this data? And we're still in the beginning of analyzing all of this, but I'll show you a little bit. Anna, in addition to the head twitch response, also went through all of the data and labeled stereotypical behaviors of the animals, such as grooming, digging, rearing, supported rearing, turns, and so on, so on. This allows us to have a look at things like this, for example, where you can see that for example, in the beginning of when we place the animal into the setup about an hour before the door is opened, the animals are burrowing quite a lot, digging around, doing things, but quite quickly after ingesting psilocybin, they stop doing that, and that recovers about 30 to 45 minutes after they eat psilocybin. Another thing one can do with these behaviors, with these labeled behaviors, is to ask the question, how does psilocybin change the transitions from one behavior to the other? Because eventually we're interested in a psychedelic state. Yeah? Does it change some kind of stereotypical behavior or order of how they do things? You get plots like this, where you can see which transitions between behaviors are more frequent under psilocybin subtracted from placebo. I will not go into details about this because this is mainly Anna's work. So find her at her poster outside. I'm sure she will be glad to guide you through all of the analysis. So this is all well and good, but there's, to me, I think something still missing here, is because when I look at a video, for example, of an animal doing a head twitch or burrowing or turning and so on, I'm describing something that makes sense to me from the outside as an observer, but I'm interested in the internal workings of the animal. I want to see what actually matters to the animal by not putting labels on things. Yeah? So one approach to do this is to do the behavioral phenotyping in an unbiased way. Yeah? I label these behaviors, but I use methods such as key point mosaic, which is an algorithm or a package that allows you to deduce stereotypical motifs or syllables of behavior from tracking data like this. Such a motif looks, for example, like this. Here's a syllable where you can see the skeleton of the animal, and it looks like it's moving forward. If you actually go and look for I don't know how to click that. It stopped the looping somehow. It's basically the animal jumping forward on top of this little enrichment here. Another example is this one here. the looping stops again. It's basically a movement where the animal retracts slightly and then turns, does a sharp turn. Yeah? In a way, I'm interpreting it also by looking at it, but this is an unbiased way of doing it, which allows us to also see, okay, what is actually happening to the animal without me putting the labels from the outside. So what can I do with this, or what happens with these motives when I give the animals psilocybin? There's quite a lot, so I'll guide you through it. So we took all of these motives that were deduced, and we looked at the frequency of these motives in bins of a few minutes over the whole time we did the recordings. So 1 hour before the door was opened up to 6 hours afterwards. And every row here is one of these syllables. On the x-axis you have time. This is the time point where we opened the little door, and this is approximately the time where the head twitch stops in all of the animals. In green, you see all of the things that increased in their frequency, so became more often, while in red, you see things that decreased. As you might appreciate, you can see some things changing, for example, after the 0 time point. For example, this block here looks like motives that all reduce after the animals ingest psilocybin. If I have a look at it, these motives, they all look like motives of high velocity or high angular velocity. So darting to the front or very fast turns to the left and right. These seem to be reduced in the beginning, but they recover around the time where also the head twitches stop. Then there's another block here that is a little bit less affected, but still significantly reduced. And these behaviors are grooming and burrowing behaviors. As I showed you before, in borrowing from what we labeled manually, so this also confirms it, but also grooming is reduced, and it recovers a little bit later than these behaviors here. Then you have a block here that initially is reduced, but then recovers quite fast. These are rearing behaviors. So the animal has, in the beginning, troubles standing up by itself without any support. While behaviors that have not been or motives that have not been affected or maybe a little bit also increased are slow turns and supported rears, something where the animal holds against something and stands up or just does a little turn to the left and right. What does this all mean? I don't really know yet, but it confirms some of the things that we've seen. There have been some contradicting data, for example, to are they moving faster, are they moving less, and so on and so on. At least from what I see here, I don't say they move less or more. I can say they avoid faster movements, but they still do short movements. If you look at total distance ran, it's actually equal between psilocybin and placebo. So these are the nuances one can add to it. Additionally, we can also do transition matrices with data like this and also try to think about individual differences between these animals. But this is just the beginning that we're actually starting to look at this data. So what is going to happen next? We like to do a dose response curve. As Beta said, this is always a good thing to establish, to actually see whether we are in the right range of dose to actually study the effects. Additionally, we noticed quite a lot of differences between the animals, also in their individual behaviors, their transition matrices, and also in the syllables. So we'd like to have a look at that and take that into account, and also analyze the group dynamics. We always do the experiments in sets of 4 animals. They're housed together. They're also recorded at the beginning of the week, always together. So we have data from before all of them got psilocybin and data from afterwards. We hope that with this data, we'll be able to at least start to define maybe what a psychedelic behavioral state is. And only then, I think, we can ask the question, what is happening on a neuronal basis in these animals? Go from behavior to neurons and vice versa. And maybe try to improve what the field is struggling with, in my opinion, understanding how these things happen. So last but not least, I'd like to thank all the people involved in this project, specifically Anna, who did a lot of the work of manual labeling of the behaviors, Rob for helping us 3D print all the parts needed for the setup, Marika and Martha for the support in the past few years, and Michael Böttcher, who does all the analytics for us of the psilocybin, SyncCube for providing the psilocybin, Ahmed and Jacob from the MPI for animal behavior, who are focused on the group dynamics of the animals before and after psilocybin, and of course the ESI team, the IT and the workshop, who provide the infrastructure to do this and also help us build these setups. Thank you for your attention.